Everyone, and welcome to this launch event for the first 5 documents in our ongoing review of existing SFHA governance documents. I'm Alan Stokes, I'm one of the policy leads at SFHA. We began the process towards the end of last year, and I'd like to kick off with a huge thank you to the consultation group of members who fed into the review of these documents, and to everyone who contributed case studies and sector examples. We're delighted to have with us Linda Ewart, who drafted the document on our behalf for what we hope will be quite an interactive session. So before I hand you over to Linda, just a few housekeeping points. If you'd like to ask a question at any point, you can do so in one of two ways. You can type this into the chat or questions section, or if you use the raise your hand icon, we can get back to you and then you can ask it directly. So this will mean using your mic. So maybe if we can just test to make sure that your mics are working, if you could all just say hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
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 That sounds great. So just to also say that we will be recording Linda's presentation, but we won't be recording the discussion session at the end. So feel free to ask anything. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Linda.
Thank you very much, Alan, and good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be part of this session, and I think just hearing everybody's voices coming from right across the country over my laptop is one of the nicest things that's happened in a long time. So it's great. Thank you all for joining us today. As Alan has explained, that the point of today's session is to introduce the first batch of governance good practice advice that SFHA has issued over the course of the last couple of days. Well, last week, I think we published 2 items last week, and the remainder were published yesterday. What I want to do today is to kind of talk you through what's in the guidance. Some of the point of doing that is really just to remind people about the resources that are available from SFHA, but also to highlight some of the features in the guidance. And then, depending on the time that's available, I think a big part of the value of today will be in providing an opportunity for people to ask questions or exchange views. So before I start, I want to just echo Alan's thanks to the people who made up the group, who contributed to the revisions, and particularly to thank those people who have provided case studies, because one of the big advantages of the good practice advice in the format that it's in now is that, as well as it including the kind of theory of how to do things, it also is matched up by some practical examples from housing associations across the country about how they go about some of the activities that the practice covers. So if we can maybe move on, then I've got Molly helping me with the slides. So thank you to Molly for her help to me talking and working the laptop. Not a good combination. So what has been published? It's always good to start with what the selection is. So actually quite a lot has been published. I think it's really important to emphasize that none of this is new. The 5 publications that have been issued over the course of the last week are updates and revisions of existing guidance that SFHA has published since 2014. That was one of the interesting things about the exercise, to go back and look at when things were first published. But I think partly because some of this is or was quite old, and conversely because some of it was published quite recently, I think there's a bit of a, maybe some of the guidance has gone kind of under the radar a wee bit. So hopefully the launch will provide an opportunity to revive interest in it. So 5 documents, the guide for governing body members, and I'm going to talk about each of those as I go through. So the guide for governing body members, a bank of model role descriptions, which are templates for organisations to customise, some guidance which I hope is practical in its application on governing body member succession planning and recruitment. Also some updated guidance on governing body member annual reviews, And finally, succession planning for senior staff. Now, I've tried to put that list together in what seems to me like a logical order, but they all do fit together. And I hope that during the course of this morning, I can maybe just draw some of the connections between the documents. I think it's really important to emphasise that what has been published and what will be published in the next 2 blocks is guidance. It's advice on how things might work in an individual organisation, but it's not intended to be prescriptive. The advice that's there is intended to be a basis for individual organisations and governing bodies to make decisions about how you want to approach things in a way that's suitable and appropriate for your organisation. So I hope that it provides you with a framework within which to undertake all of these activities, but not to tell you absolutely how to do things to every last detail. So just to back that up, the documents or the guidance is intended to be customised to suit individual organisations, and for that reason the format that it's been published in has quite a lot of optional extras. So for example, in terms of the guide for governing body members, which I'm going to talk about first, there's a lot of square brackets throughout that guidance where the terminology needs to be customised to reflect your own particular circumstances. So I think the language that we've used in the published version is to refer to the governing body as the board, but many housing associations talk about management committees or committees of management, and so you would just change that to suit your own requirements. Similarly, language like director or chief executive officer in some of the other documents, you would adapt that to suit your own requirements too. And there are some templates that are there again to provide a framework for you to adapt things to meet your own requirements, or to disregard and continue using your own tools if that's what suits you better. As I've already mentioned, there are case studies in all of the documents, I think, which indicate how other housing associations have used the guidance in the past, or how they have approached particular areas. So things like governing body member annual reviews. The guidance sets out how you might do things, provide some advice, and then there are some examples of how particular organisations have used that in their own situations. In revising the guidance, obviously I've tried to take account of the new regulatory framework that was introduced in 2019. That was probably the prompt for the revisions, because we had to change things to reflect the new requirements. But I think what I would want to emphasise is that in revising the guidance and in reissuing it, the intention is that this will support housing associations in demonstrating and for governing body members gaining assurance about compliance and about good practice. And so that's really the purpose of the bank, the suite of documents. And throughout the various revisions, I've tried to identify where some of the practices that are being discussed would contribute, for example, to the evidence bank that individual organisations are maintaining to support the preparation and submission of the annual assurance statement. And so the focus is very much on providing assurance to organisations rather than ticking a box to say we comply. And I think it's really important to draw that distinction. But these 5 documents, I hope, all fit together one way or another into a bit of a jigsaw, and will help organisations to demonstrate particularly compliance with Regulatory Standard 6. But actually, when I was looking at things again, I think much of the guidance in these 5 documents covers the majority of the standards. So I think, Standard 1, Standard 3, Standard 4, Standard 5, Standard 6 are all relevant to the topics that I'm going to be talking about this morning. So that's a kind of overview as to where we've got to and why the documents are being reissued. So if I can move on, Molly, please, to the next slide and just talk a bit about the guide for governing body members. This was first published in 2014, which was quite a long time ago, and it came about as the result of a suggestion from the Flare group of housing associations, which operates in Renfrewshire. And they had identified a need for a document which really provided a bit of an overview of what a housing association is, what it does, what its structure is, what the responsibilities of the governing body member are. And instead of them deciding to do things themselves, they suggested to SFHA that it might be a resource that would be helpful for the sector as a whole. And so in its first character, the guide was published in 2014. What I've done for the 2021 version is to update the guide, but in structure, it remains very similar to what it was before, and it tries to provide an overview of an individual housing association, but within the context of the social housing sector in Scotland. So this is one of the documents that you could take off the shelf as a housing association or co-op and adapt to reflect your own organisation. So instead of talking about the RSL, you would talk about a particular housing association, whether it be Forth or Scottish Veterans or Almond or whoever. And you would put in the details of your own organisation so that whoever is reading the document gets a picture of what it would be like to be part of that organisation. So you would include information about stock, about location, about regulatory engagement status, about your constitutional structure, whether most housing associations, but not all, are registered societies. So you would produce some of that information, your OSCR registration number, all that kind of thing. And the document would then be able to be used as part of a recruitment pack if you were running a recruitment exercise for new governing body members, part of the induction pack. It's also a good introduction for staff members who are maybe new to the sector joining the organisation, because it brings together all the kind of vital information about what you do, why you do it, what's important to you, and some of the particular activities that you might be involved in. So for example, there's space for you to customise the details about regeneration activities that you might be involved in, or big lottery funded initiatives that you might be involved in, so that you can, as I say, paint a picture of your organisation. And that can be very useful, as I say, as an induction tool, but also as a tool for providing an overview of your organisation, just to people who are interested in your work. So it's something that you would keep up to date on a regular basis, and that would inform training and development. So it's intended to be something that you would update regularly, because obviously some of this information goes out of date fairly quickly, but also adapt if your organisation changes. So for example, if over the course of time you became involved in entering into a group structure, either by acquiring a subsidiary and developing a subsidiary organisation to do something that a registered housing association can't do, you would write another wee bit of the guide and include that in it, so that it remains up to date. So that's the guide for governing body members, and first published in 2014, updated now to reflect the changed regulatory environment and also the changes that have occurred in the sector over the last 6-7 years. And I hope that that's useful for people. So if we can move on then to look at the next item, which is the model role descriptions. These were published maybe about 5 years ago, I think, in their first format, and they haven't changed substantially in the new versions. We have role descriptions for governing body members, and additionally for the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary, so the key roles within the governing body. Again, I want to emphasise these are templates. They reflect all of the responsibilities that a governing body member has, as are set out in the constitutional standards that make up part of the regulatory framework. They reflect the SFHA's model rules, and to that extent, the rules that the role descriptions are based on are the 2020 model, which I know not everyone has adopted, but actually most of the references are just the same as the references in the 2015 model rules. But they are templates that individual organisations will want to customise. As well as explaining the responsibilities for governing body members, what we've tried to do in these model role descriptions is also explain some of the benefits to try and emphasise that it's a bit of a two-way process. And because I know I spend a lot of time talking to governing body members, and I know how much governing body members get out of their role as a voluntary committee member or board member. And I think it's important to emphasize that in the role description. It's not just all about giving, it's about getting some benefits as well. We've tried to set those out again so that there is clarity for board members and committee members about what's involved, but also to be clear with people who are thinking about offering to participate, be clear about what the responsibilities are, but also to be clear about the potential for a sense of fulfilment for what you get out of the role that governing body members undertake. Also tried to highlight some good practice. So for example, there are some optional parts in the role descriptions, particularly those relating to the chair and the vice chair, about multiple offices. So we're not, again, this is not prescriptive, but what we have said in the role descriptions, or we've included an optional clause, is to say, for example, that the chair of the governing body shouldn't also be the chair of subcommittees. So that's where some of this connects in with some of the other documentation, particularly around succession planning, for example. Because if you've got the chair of the governing body also being the chair of a subcommittee, that means that there's not the opportunity for other members of the governing body to gain the experience of chairing a subcommittee that they might otherwise have the opportunity to benefit from. So there are some connections between the role descriptions and the guidance on succession planning, but that also reflects good practice to make sure that people aren't wearing too many hats within the same organisation. But again, want to emphasise, this is advice, it's not prescription. We've also tried to set out or provide an opportunity or a prompt for individual organisations to think about how much time is involved in being a member of the governing body. So there's a table towards the end where you can have a bit of a think about how much time is involved in attending committee meetings or board meetings, preparing for meetings, time spent attending training or away days, so that there's a bit of a sense on the part of new people as to what they're letting themselves in for and what your expectations are. And I think that's important, really in the interests of transparency and clarity. The role descriptions also make reference to one of the other elements of the guidance, which is around governing body member annual reviews, and do say that they form the role descriptions are likely to form the basis of some of the annual reviews. But I suppose one of the points that I want to emphasise is that the role descriptions are there to set out the framework of responsibilities. They're not intended to be a checklist that would form the basis of the annual appraisal. So I would hate to see appraisals or annual reviews being carried out on the basis of the role description in one hand and a pencil in the other, and going through and ticking off whether or not people have fulfilled individual responsibilities. That's not how these are intended to be used. They're intended to provide a framework to inform people about the responsibilities that go with the role. They can also be used, very importantly, to identify training requirements. So, for example, people who have been members of the governing body for a few years and then office-bearing roles, the role description for, say, the chair can provide an important and useful prompt to identify training requirements. I was talking to a chair earlier this week who was saying to me that very happy to have taken on the role of chair, but didn't realise, because no one told him, but didn't realise that there would be a responsibility to carry out the annual appraisal for the chief officer. Having looked at the role description, that was clear, and that identified a training need. Not to say you can't be chair because you don't have that experience, but to say in order to do this, there is some training that needs to be undertaken. So that's important. There's a connection with training, a connection with annual reviews, and a connection with succession planning also, because that's a very important element of succession planning. The role description should also reflect the individual organisation's standing orders and scheme of delegation. So make sure that they all tie up. Don't include anything in role descriptions that aren't supported by the scheme of delegation, for example, because the role descriptions do talk about authority for decision making, for example. So if the scheme of delegation doesn't also support that, then there's a wee bit of a problem there. So there needs to be a bit of an audit between these documents to make sure that they are fit for your own individual purposes. So if we can move on, I know I'm going to do this quite quickly, but I think it's important to get plenty of time for people to ask questions. So if we can move on, thanks Molly, to succession planning and recruitment, which I've already mentioned a bit. This is a reissued guidance from a few years ago, but updated to reflect experience and to reflect good practice. The intention behind the governing body member succession planning and recruitment guidance is to enable organisations, RSLs, housing associations, to plan ahead and, as far as possible, future-proof. It's not bomb-proof because the unexpected happens, and that's obviously been abundantly clear in the last year. But by employing effective succession planning for both governing bodies and for senior staff, hopefully there is at least good contingency planning and continuity arrangements in place. So in its current format, the guidance emphasises the connection between succession planning and business planning. And I think for people that maybe aren't familiar with the guidance, that maybe seems a bit of a leap because the two processes are a bit different, but actually the objectives and the outcomes are the same. Because the succession planning is about being clear about what an organisation needs in order to deliver against its key objectives. And the business plan is about setting out what those key objectives are and identifying the resources that are required to deliver against the objectives and be clear about whether or not those resources are available. So the two, in my brain, fit very well. Essentially, business planning should come first. And I know that organisations undertake business planning on a cyclical basis, usually a big review every 3 to 5 years with annual updates. And the guidance suggests that succession planning should be a component of the business planning exercise to make sure that in reviewing the objectives of the housing association, the governing body is also keeping under constant review whether or not there is access to the range of skills, knowledge and experience that the governing body needs to lead the organisation effectively to deliver the objectives that are set out in the business plan. So a component of succession planning is to have a board or management committee profile that really just describes the range of skills, knowledge, experience, qualities that the governing body collectively needs to have. And again, it's really important to say that not every member of the governing body is expected to have all of what's listed on a profile. The profile is intended to be a collective illustration of what the governing body as a whole collectively brings to the table. And individuals have different skills and particular strengths. So the profile should be a component of the business plan, and that might change from time to time as the objectives and the priorities of a housing association alter to meet different priorities or to respond to different circumstances. The succession planning and the profile should be informed by annual reviews. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but one of the outcomes of the annual reviews of governing body members should be an understanding of the range of skills, knowledge and experience that the organisation is lucky enough to have access to. And that then provides an opportunity to identify where there might be particular gaps or where there might be particular vulnerabilities, because one of the things about succession planning is to, as well as identify what's available just now and what might be needed in the future, is also to identify what you might be at risk of losing. And so the annual review should, and succession planning should include consideration of what governing body members' intentions might be over the life of the business plan, so that the succession plan can be used to inform recruitment strategies and other initiatives to expand or extend or strengthen the range of experience and expertise that's represented on the governing body. So the succession planning guidance provides some tips, I hope, on how to undertake and approach succession planning. There's a template that you can use and adapt for your own requirements. But it also provides some guidance and advice on recruitment strategies and processes, how to go about recruiting new governing body members. And it also highlights the importance of not just kind of concluding automatically that because there's maybe been a perceived gap identified, that you necessarily need to go out and recruit somebody new. And it might be that some training for an individual member of the governing body who has a particular interest somewhere would fit the bill, or it might be that maybe a short-term co-option for something that was very specific to your organisation's requirements would fit the bill as well, rather than going out and looking for somebody to join the governing body on a kind of long-term basis. Maybe a short-term co-option would be worth thinking about. So there are some things to think about identified in the succession planning guidance there. We also provide some guidance around, additional guidance around recruiting for the chair and office bearing roles. And that's again where the connection back to the role descriptions come into play, about providing a framework within which to think about the particular skills and qualities that chairs and other office bearers need in order to fulfil their additional responsibilities, and how to maybe provide training for people who are interested in taking on those roles, or how to maybe target future recruitment. We also explore a wee bit the pros and cons of going out specifically to recruit, for example, a chair. So there are some pros and cons discussed about the benefits of or otherwise of advertising for a chair, or on the other hand, what might be termed growing your own. And again, that's something that's a really important feature of succession planning, because if you can capture some interest from an existing governing body member who says, well, not ready to be chair or vice chair just now, but a few years I might be quite interested in thinking about that. Very important part of succession planning is to support people with that level of interest in developing their maybe just confidence, but maybe areas of experience to enable them to take on that role. So as I say, some highlights, it highlights some things to think about, some things to think about doing, and some things to be cautious about avoiding, and provides some templates for individual adaptation and use. So if we can move on then please to the next one, which is governing body member annual reviews. Thank you, Molly. The governing body member annual reviews guidance in its first guise was published, I think, in 2015, which was when what was and still is in some areas termed appraisals were being required by the regulatory standards. The tone, I think, of the 2021 guidance, I would like to think has changed, because my starting point is to say that annual reviews are now widely accepted across the sector. I think there was quite a lot of hesitation amongst housing associations about the requirement to introduce annual reviews, but I think the way in which housing associations have adopted and adapted the process or the requirement to meet your own needs has gone a long way to ensuring that people feel pretty comfortable with the annual programme of reviews, however they are carried out in individual organisations. As with all of the guidance, this guidance is not prescriptive about how organisations go about annual reviews. There are 4 or 5 different options offered, and they're not exclusive. There are lots of other options that can be undertaken, and you know, some organisations do a bit of a mix and match, which is absolutely fine. And I think this is one area where, just as SFHA's guidance is not prescriptive, the fact that there is no regulatory prescription about how annual reviews are carried out has greatly helped to reducing the anxiety that people felt, very understandably, about the introduction of something that was very new. And I think consequently, my experience is that with a lot of variety and a lot of variation, this is something that now works pretty well in every organisation that I know. So the guidance emphasises that there is no prescribed format, but what it does consider is why a housing association would undertake annual reviews of governing body member effectiveness, and the answer is not because the regulator requires it. What I've tried to explain in or describe in the guidance are the benefits that can be achieved for individuals and for organisations about carrying out annual reviews in a supportive and collaborative way. First and foremost, annual reviews are a way of saying thank you to governing body members for the enormous contribution that they give to an organisation year in and year out. And I think if annual reviews are conducted in a supportive way, it's a very positive way and mechanism for ensuring or hopefully ensuring that the contributions of governing body members are valued and demonstrating the value that's attached to those contributions. So the guidance explains why. It looks at various options as to how annual reviews can be carried out. It talks a bit about the when. Now that's not just annually, because that is the requirement, but it talks about timing in the year when you might do that. Some organisations are busy doing their annual reviews now, kind of February, March, April. Others wait until later in the year after the AGMs are all done. So for some organisations that's August, September, October. For other organisations it's October, November, December time. And it's no surprise and no accident that I'm kind of talking about 3-month chunks, because that tends to be the period over which the annual reviews take place, then they're all written up, then the succession plan is produced, and finally the report goes to the governing body about the outcome of all of that. So kind of 3-month process from start to finish. And that's important in terms of factoring in time commitments, not so much for individual governing body members, but for the chair, because one of the other aspects that we look at in the guidance is who should be involved. Clearly, the chair has a pivotal role in carrying out the annual reviews, because one of the other big benefits of the annual reviews is that it is an opportunity for some 1-to-1 quality time, or 2-to-1 quality time, however many people are involved, and we do talk about that in the guidance, but some quality time, not in the context of a governing body meeting, between the chair and members of the management committee or the board. So lots of flexibility, lots of highlighting of examples, lots of suggestions. But the guidance does suggest some basics. Personal engagement is key. It shouldn't be a form that somebody fills in, ticks off or writes bits and then sends back into some kind of black hole and gets nothing back from. So there should be some personal engagement in the conduct of the annual reviews. And one of the changes in the current version of the guidance is to be, I think, much more positive about virtual engagement. You can have personal engagement on the phone or in this kind of format. And my experience is, and I know the experience of lots of organisations, is that surprisingly, this seems to be working quite well. With all its limitations, it's working quite well. So some personal engagement. I would strongly encourage people to make sure that the annual reviews are undertaken in a fairly consistent way. So some kind of structure that applies to every discussion that takes place, because you can't people are different, but the method by which the effectiveness of individual contributions is reviewed needs to be consistent. Otherwise, you'll end up with just a big kind of mismatch and a fruit barrel of different kinds of comparisons. So try and make sure that there's a consistent approach, both in terms of approach and in terms of the people who are involved. And one way or another, the annual reviews should look at both individual effectiveness and collective effectiveness. And because if there are issues about individuals and their effectiveness, that might be down to maybe the dynamics of the governing body or the practicalities of the meetings. So you have to look at the collective effectiveness as well. You can do that by means of two different mechanisms, or you can do it all in the one discussion. And the guidance goes on to talk about that. One of the other areas that there has been some change is to do with assessing continuing effectiveness and the 9-year rule, the notorious 9-year rule. I think back in 2015, when this became a requirement, there was understandably a lot of nervousness and quite a lot of resentment, which I think again was very understandable, that people felt, well, I've done 9 years and now I'm being put aside. That was not the intention, and I think it's fair to say that was not the intention, and that should not be the intention. My approach is to say that committee members, governing body members, are expected to be effective no matter how long they've been involved, with obviously some understanding for people who are very new, because it does take a while to get into the swing of things. And so the guidance in the 2021 format has moved away from additional questions that are asked to people who have longer lengths of service. And there is more support for the same approach, a consistent approach, being used in respect of people regardless of their length of service, because committee members who have completed 4 years of service should be as effective as people who have completed 10 or 11 years of service, and the same questions, I think, can legitimately be asked of everyone. What is important is that the outcome of the annual reviews provides a framework within which the governing body can reach a view about whether or not someone who has completed 9 or more years continuous service continues to contribute effectively and therefore can stand for re-election at the point at which their retirement becomes due. So that's one area where I think there's maybe a bit of a change in terms of the guidance. As with all of the other documents, we've included some templates and suggestions to make sure that there's some pointers, I suppose, for people who are maybe thinking about reviewing your existing approach or doing things a bit differently. Again, when the guidance was first published in 2015, it was with the intention of equipping organisations to introduce something new. The focus now is much more on making sure that you keep the process fresh, making sure that it doesn't become stale or routine, and that it continues to deliver value to individuals and to organisations. So that's whistle-stop tour through governing body member annual reviews. If we can move on then just to the final element of the good practice bank that has been published, and that is senior staff succession planning. In its first form, this was published in, I think, 2019. And our sense is that whilst it did attract quite a lot of discussion, it maybe kind of flew under the radar a bit. And so hopefully by reissuing the guidance with some amendment now, it will raise the profile, because it's certainly something that is in quite sharp focus. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been struck by the fact that there's quite a bit of turnover within the sector just now at senior level. So the senior staff succession planning guidance is intended to complement the governing body member succession planning guidance. So the two should work quite well together. Just as I said with governing body member succession planning, Senior staff succession planning has a relevance to business planning as well, because just as the business plan needs to be supported by effective leaders at governing body level, it needs to be delivered by effective managers and directors who have that strategic focus that's appropriate for and fits with the strategic objectives of the organisation. So senior staff succession planning guidance is aimed at chairs, office bearers and senior staff, because it's relevant to everyone. It's the role of the governing body to make sure that there is a senior staff succession plan in place. It's the role of the chair to make sure that the senior officer, his or her performance is annually reviewed, so that the appraisal is carried out and reported back to the governing body, not in minute detail, but just the headline kind of stuff. So there are parallels there. I talked earlier about the connections with all the different regulatory standards, and I think probably the succession planning guidance makes that point quite emphatically, because there is a connection between succession planning and risk management, because one of the big risks to an organisation is that either key people in the governing body leave for one reason or another, or that key members of the senior management team leave. It's better if you have a bit of a heads up that people might be on the move, and succession planning is intended to give you a bit of an idea as to whether or not people have plans to be in post for some time, or whether in terms of career development or in terms of retirement, they see their future being a bit more limited with the organisation. Because succession planning is all about planning ahead, future proofing, making sure that you have continuity arrangements in place. Because there's a connection between succession planning and annual appraisals, there is some additional advice in this guidance about how to conduct the chief executive's appraisal or the director's appraisal. That's obviously a responsibility that sits with the chair primarily, but supported by other office bearing members typically. So there is some additional guidance there. But I think it's really important to emphasise that this is not this particular guidance is not a how-to guide in terms of HR advice. It doesn't contain HR advice, and specialist HR advice must always be sought from your recognised or usual advisors. It does provide some guidance on how to recruit a new chief executive or director, but again, these are options and hints about how you might want to go about things. Provide a list of things to think about in terms of how to manage a situation where you maybe have internal candidates, how you resource this kind of exercise, how to make sure that the necessarily greater level of involvement that governing body members will have in the event of a vacancy of the senior officer doesn't mean that the governing body or the office bearers end up having to roll their sleeves up and get involved in running the organisation, because that won't happen. So succession planning is about making sure that risk is avoided. It also emphasises the role of the business plan in providing a framework for making a decision, for the governing body making a decision about how you're going to respond to the departure of the senior officer. And again, there's a bit of a change here as a result of the revision of the guidance, and indeed in changes in the regulatory framework. The 2021 succession planning guidance is absolutely explicit now, probably more explicit than it was before, that the business plan provides the framework for decision making about whether or not you're going to recruit a new senior officer, or whether or not you're going to think about other options. What the regulator will expect or will want to be assured of is that the housing association has an up-to-date business plan. And if there is an up-to-date business plan, that the decision-making process about how you're going to manage the departure of the senior officer fits with what the business plan says. And it's only if the business plan is either not up to date or is not consistent with recommended practice. Now, that doesn't mean slavishly following the recommended practice, but taking account of the recommended practice. And for now, that means the 2015 business planning recommended practice issued by the regulator and their supplementary August 2020 update on business planning. Providing the business plan takes out, your own business plan has sufficiently long to run, and takes account of that guidance, there shouldn't really be an expectation that you would carry out a standalone options appraisal, because that would have formed part of the business planning process that you have undertaken anyway. So as long as your business plan hasn't only got 6 months to run, you should be safe and secure in using the business plan as the framework for decision making. But obviously you want to make sure that it's robust, and that's the whole point of a business plan. So as with the other guidance, there are some points to consider, some things to think about, as I've already mentioned, and there is a template and an example of succession planning or a tool that you could use in order to inform your organisation's own activities. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour through what's been published. And if we can just flip to the final slide, Molly, I can just explain what the next stages are. As I've already mentioned, there are case studies already in the guidance, and we're so grateful to those of you who have provided those. But more case studies and examples will be added as they become available. And that's one of the big benefits of the way in which the guidance is being published now, because it's a kind of live bank of resources. The guidance will be developed in response to members' feedback. So if, as a result of today, for example, there's a suggestion about a particular element that could be expanded or developed, then consideration will be given to doing that. Alan can say more about the governance forum, but that is a mechanism for members to network and share experience, and that can inform SFHA's plans about future pieces of work. But there are commitments to another 2 blocks of revised guidance. Block 2, which is now underway, to revise the Code of Conduct and the Entitlements, Payments and Benefits policy, and that's going to be progressed between now and the end of the financial year. Fingers crossed. And block 3, which deals with internal audit and the assurance toolkit, which will be after March into the first quarter of the new year. But we are very open to other suggestions which can form part of the discussion too. So that's, I hope, an overview of the 5 elements of guidance that have been published over the course of the last week. And I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of what's there. And now I think I'm going to pause, and hopefully some people might have some comments or some questions. But thank you all for listening to me prattling on.